Hello and welcome to Madrid Direct. Today we are having a conversation with Fabiana D'Atri, Senior Economist at Bradesco. We'll talk about the macroeconomic outlook for Brazil and the future of its currency, the real. Fabiana D'Atri, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So what's the economic outlook for Brazil in terms of growth for next year?
The outlook is a little bit challenged. We are forecasting hard years, partly explained by some adjustments that we are facing and part of the external environment. So the big numbers that we have is the GDP declining 3.3% this year that we are just closing. And for the next year, we are also forecasting a decline of 2%.
Mm-hmm. How long do you expect the recession to go on? How many years?
Actually, considering the numbers, this year, next year will be the worst period. And then we see some recover in the next years. The recovery will be really gradual, slow, and we are going to take some years to come back to a growth that we faced in the last years, around 3-4%.
Mm-hmm. What are the main challenges, the most urgent reforms that Brazil has to face?
Firstly, we need to move on the fiscal adjustment itself. So it implies cutting some expenses and increasing the revenues just to focus on the short term. But in the long term, as we are discussing the last years, it's not something new, but we need to focus on the pension system reform to discuss the age of retirement, the way we adjust the benefits, because we have this deficit in the security accounts. Social security accounts. And then, of course, we need to rediscuss taxes, consolidating in a more federal way because we have differences around the regions, the provinces. So maybe the fiscal is the first, pension and taxes reform. And finally, it's not a reform, but it's a way to rethink Brazil, is to reopen the economy, making some new agreements around the world.
Mm-hmm. What are the prospects for the Brazilian currency, the real?
I don't have the crystal ball, but we are discussing that maybe the old fundamentals as the US dollar, China, commodity prices, they are not enough to explain. So we are focusing on the way the investors and the society is facing all the adjustments. So just to put a variable, the CDS variable, that the credit default swap, maybe it's the summing up of how the investors are facing Brazil. So if you are going to see some accommodation of the stress that we faced in the last months, something around 4% is a good forecast for the next years. Mm-hmm. And of course, since we establish a level around 4, we are going to have the next years just the differential from the inflation from Brazil, from the world. So maybe something around 4 is a good forecast.
This is a complicated issue, but how much exposed is Brazil to external factors like China or the US interest rates?
At the first glance, we should say, Brazil is really exposed to China. But what's really interesting is that it's sure, it's true, but if you analyze the last numbers, we are increasing our food exports to China. So we are being affected in the positive way when consumption grows in China, not only soybean and grains, but also, and maybe more important, protein and in a small measure, maybe sugar and coffee. So we have huge opportunities, but surely as we see significant slowdown in construction and industrial segments in China, the metal demand is coming down. When you consider the U.S. effect, of course, Fed, we believe that a Fed will increase the interest rate in the next weeks. We are going to have a new environment for interest rate and capital flows, but as Brazil is really a part during this year from the external environment and external effects, we don't believe that the Fed decision itself will affect our interest rate and affect our currency, because we have domestic issues that are playing much more relevant movement and factor at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Last question, from a most optimistic point of view, what's the main strength in Brazilian economy internally?
Nowadays, agricultural sector is performing really, really well. If you travel to regions that are focused on agriculture, you're going to ask yourself, where is the crisis? Because people are really happy and they export, of course, the depreciation of the currency is helping them. But besides the agricultural sector, we believe that we are going to see not only, maybe not this year and next year, because we are in a difficult period, but moving on the medium term, infrastructure will be one of the drivers for Brazil. And reopening the economy implies that we are going to have new export markets, and we have a strong industry that can export. So those three trends must be followed: agricultural, infrastructure, and export potential.
Fabiana D'Atri, thanks.
Thank you so much.
That was it for today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next Madrid Direct.